Hi, everyone, and welcome back to part two of our webinar series celebrating Occupational Therapy Month and National Disability Employment Awareness Month, and also in honor of Gowan Consulting's 25th anniversary. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Nicolette Gowan, and I am proudly a registered occupational therapist and also the owner of Gowan Consulting. We are thankful to once again have Kelly Stewart and Rebecca Gewirtz continuing their discussion on best practices to support disabled workers throughout their employment life cycle. Last week, they talked about hiring and interviewing, and this week they're going to be focusing more on setting up employees for success. So that includes onboarding and the importance of supporting disclosure and ensuring psychological safety, and also providing supportive workplace accommodations. As mentioned, this will be a webinar format, so we do ask you to please mute your microphones, add any of your questions into the chat as Kelly and Rebecca are presenting, and we are going to save some time to answer any of your questions at the end. So this session is being recorded, just so everyone knows. If you wanted to turn off your video, now is a good time to do that. While we get started here, I'd love to know who is here. So in our chat box, I'd love you to share where you're joining from today, your role, and anything you're hoping to get out of the session. While you're doing that, I would like to begin by acknowledging all of the Indigenous peoples of all of the lands that we're on today. Well, yes, we're meeting on a virtual platform. I do still want to take that moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we all call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their culture. So from coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded and treaty territories of all of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations peoples that call Turtle Island home. I am personally grateful to join from a land that is the traditional territory of Anishinaabeg, Wendat, Nianwencio, Haudenosaunee, Petun, and Mississauga territories. The land that is now called Barrie, Ontario, is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. I also acknowledge that this land is still home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I encourage everyone here today to carve out time to learn more about the Indigenous nations in your area, understand more about the meaning of our signed treaties, and take action towards truth and reconciliation. And as a reminder, we are recognizing National Disability Employment Awareness Month, but we also have to be aware that the inequality still exists today, especially for Indigenous peoples, with a 30% higher rate of disabilities within the Indigenous population in Canada. And we know that these nations continue to be affected by disparities and often aren't able to reach full social and economic inclusion. So we are today discussing the importance of recruiting and hiring and supporting employees with disabilities, but just hope that you also think about your programming on a larger scale that also helps to offer economic opportunities to Indigenous peoples and communities. All right, I would love to introduce our presenters. First, we have Kelly Stewart. Kelly brings over 19 years of experience in occupational therapy. She has a master's degree in occupational therapy, and she is our training manager at Gowan Consulting. She plays a pivotal role in developing our training and supporting workplaces on many different topics, including neurodiversity and fostering inclusivity and productivity. So thank you, Kelly. And Rebecca Gewirtz is an occupational therapist and an associate professor in the School of Rehabilitation Science at McMaster University, an adjunct scientist at the Institute for Work and Health. She is the director of the Inclusive Design for Employment Access, also known as IDEA, and the co-lead of Hub 2 Employment Support System. So we're really looking forward to learning from both of you today. You bring a breadth of experience to this conversation. Before I pass it over to Rebecca, I just want to remind you about who we are at Gowan Consulting and remind you that we're celebrating our 25th year in business. We were developed based on a passion of our founder, Nancy Gowan, 25 years ago, who really was and is still passionate about advancing disability management best practice and also promoting the invaluable role of occupational therapy within the workplace, really carving a path for occupational therapy to support workers with disabilities and that whole disability management process. Today, we continue to focus on functional abilities and work. We provide assessments and intervention for employees with disabilities, which includes accommodation assessments, ergonomics, mental health support, return to work services, and of course, lots of different training programs for leaders and organizations. We also provide consultation to assist you in implementing some of the best practices, including those that will be outlined today. Thank you so much for joining us, and I am going to pass it over to our presenters. Please take it away, Rebecca.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here and looking forward to our discussion in honor of all the events that are happening, OT Month and so forth. And I'm really excited. Continue to write who you are in the chat. It's really nice to know who we're speaking to, and nice to know there's HR professionals in the on the line. Inclusive Design for Employment Access, or IDEA, is a social innovation laboratory focused on knowledge to practice. And it's funded, we have federal funds through the New Frontiers in Research Transformation stream. And our focus within IDEA is advancing the skills and capabilities of workplace parties in the area of inclusive employment, with a focus on developing evidence-informed products that support inclusive workplaces. And we do have a website that you can start to explore some of the things that we are working on and developing over the next few years. So I encourage you to go in and check that out. I'll pass it on to you, Kelly.
Great. So just to recap, we did review a number of topics last session, focusing a little bit more on that recruiting and hiring, interviewing sections of the employee's journey. For this session, we're going to be looking at a little bit more that fostering inclusion within the organization for the employees that are in place, accommodation, best practices around that onboarding piece, and then providing you with some resources.
One word to describe why hiring people with disabilities is good for business.
One word. Let me think of one word. You put me on the spot.
Sorry, man, I gotta think about that one word.
It's really hard. One word.
The one word that I would use is retention.
Inclusivity. Opportunity.
Innovation. Solutions.
Bottom line. Skill set.
Pride.
Culture.
The President's Group, as a group of business leaders, is really committed to results and action. So I think our collective commitment is to really move the needle on the number of people that are employed in our province who identify as having diverse abilities.
Of course, this is the right thing to do, but this is actually a great business decision. In a world where competition for talent is only growing, it just makes sense to look out everywhere and gather the best people you can.
The biggest misconception that people have about hiring people with disabilities is that it will be a burden, and that's simply untrue.
Our best employees are the ones that we understand what their strengths are, they understand what the work is they need to do, and we build an opportunity for them to work for our companies in that context. It's no different for people with disabilities.
There's so many opportunities for small businesses to kind of pivot where large organizations may not be able to do that in the same way.
It has a natural impact on the team and the culture that you're creating, an inclusive and belonging culture for all your team members. And to me, that translates to a more engaged team and to team members who want to stay with your company longer.
You take care of the people, and they will take care of your customers. And when you take care of your customers, they're going to take care of your business. A great place to start is to reach out to the other people who've been down that road before.
If you want, call somebody from the President's Group. That's part of the reason we exist, is for you to call us and ask us, who should I talk to? What are the next steps I should take?
Hiring people with disabilities is easier than you think. It'll bring results not only to your bottom line, but to your organization that are greater than you can predict. It'll build morale, it'll build your business, and it'll build a better province.
All right, so in that video, we heard a little bit about how fostering inclusion in your organization can have a number of benefits. So I'm going to pass it over to Rebecca to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so when we talk about inclusion in the context of the workplace, it's really a change in thinking about how we construct our workplaces. So, as some of you joined last week we talked a little bit about hiring, and we traditionally recruiting and hiring, and we traditionally hire people who fit the mold of of the types of people who have always been within the organization. And we typically expect that jobs will be done as they always have been done. But sometimes doing things differently can benefit everyone. And we're going to get into some of this discussion throughout the next hour or so. But sometimes doing things differently can increase safety and create a more positive place in the workplace. So this really requires a culture change. And it really shifts the way we think about things, um, about how we create organizations that can accommodate different diversity. So, so what we've learned from talking to employers is that they are generally ready and willing. They understand the benefits, but sometimes they struggle on how to go about accommodating people and how to create inclusion in the workplace. And that's really where some of the things we're going to talk about today and the work with occupational therapists can really help. So going to the next slide, just recapping a little bit from last week, we talked about inclusive recruitment and hiring, as well as unconscious bias. And today we're going to continue with some additional points around fostering inclusion. So in fostering inclusion or creating inclusive work environments, organizations need to think about how they can create this as part of their culture. And this can include awareness and training for managers and teams to really set the stage for inclusion. It can include removing environmental barriers, not only in the built environment, but also in terms of attitudes, and also creating team psychological safety, which we'll get into now.
Sorry about that. I would like you just to take a moment first before I share to kind of think about what you know about psychological safety or what you have heard, what your interpretation or perspective is on psychological safety in the workplace. Because when we've had these chats with people, there's, varying understandings and perspectives around that. And so what we want to first start out of thinking about what is psychological safety. And it's key to ensuring that for you and your colleagues and your teams, that you have what you need to be successful in the work environment. So creating that environment where people can feel confident to take appropriate risks within the support of their own team. And this psychological safety is created by or fostered by the overall group. Having diversity of perspective and being accepting of and listening to various perspectives benefits your team and everyone in the organization. And diverse teams aren't necessarily smarter by default, but we know from research that diverse teams tend to function best when they are able to foster that psychological safety. And so there can be a need to disrupt that status quo to create an environment where everyone can perform their best, share their perspectives, but really in the end help their team to perform their best. It allows everyone to tap into that richness of their members on the team and to unpack and understand each person's perspective with some curiosity versus placing judgment. And this can then impact innovation and can really help the organization to meet its goals and to soar. So we want to think about how can we foster and create transparency within an organization and teams and amongst coworkers and colleagues. And psychological safety even encourages conscientious dissent. So it's okay to go against the norm and to ask questions. And that in the end, the results are better versus having everyone following the same things and doing the same things without question all the time. And psychological safety really works to have trust and encourages having active listening amongst teams to be able to accomplish that safety. And it's a part of inclusion. And so this is why I wanted to highlight this a little bit when we're talking about fostering inclusion in organizations and disability and inclusion in the workplace. So also I wanted to touch on what it's not. Sometimes people may have the perspective that psychological safety is really just warm and fuzzy. It's maybe being equated to creating a feel-good, safe space. And people may have this perspective that it's, agreeing with everybody, what everybody says and, that type of thing. But really, it's not. So we want to think about people feeling safe and having the opportunity to share perspective, a countering perspective, as well as others to be able to have open and honest discussions about those points shared, to really come with a collaborative approach and having people feeling comfortable to speak up when they need to versus feeling that they have to hold back and then waiting to let things happen that maybe don't go well because they should have been comfortable to speak up sooner. So really fostering that psychological safety is fostering a belief that no one will be punished or humiliated for speaking up with their ideas or questions or concerns or mistakes, but instead we're going to work collaboratively through those processes. If there is a concern or mistake, then how can we work together to fix that and improve on that going forward? And so it's not just saying what everyone wants to hear. It can be challenging some of those perspectives or approaches that you've been doing all along in teams. And it doesn't mean that it's a no criticism zone. There's definitely place for constructive feedback. And implementing psychological safety or ensuring psychological safety in your organization is not a one-time solution. It's an ongoing journey and to work towards the level that you want, but as well, it needs to be ongoing and continuing throughout the organization and throughout time. Okay. And so with that being said, thinking about people being comfortable and being able to share and ask questions, we then want to think about as well disclosure. So are we fostering that environment in our workplace where individuals with disabilities who may need accommodation or support feel comfortable enough to disclose and let you know that, yes, they do have some form of disability where they may need those accommodations or supports. And so disclosure is really the practice or process of self-identifying as a person with a disability. So being able to say, I have a disability that may be impacting me at work. It can sometimes be considered as part of self-advocacy. So for advocating for your needs and your support requirements. And often it's needed for disclosure or for accommodation. So people are needing to say, I have a disability in order to obtain accommodations. They're typically in most workplaces not able to just say, I think I need an accommodation for this. They are needing to provide some reasoning. And so it puts a little bit of onus on the person to feel comfortable with bringing that forward. And so when we're thinking about workplace environments and maybe challenging the status quo and trying to push ourselves towards more inclusive work environments, there can be a bit of a consideration to think about a person identifying their need for accommodation versus perhaps having a medical diagnosis. So is there some functional impact that they're experiencing? I have difficulty to do X, Y, Z, versus having to disclose I have a medical diagnosis. So that's just something to think about. Some organizations may be implementing those processes. And early on in the accommodation process, the employee may not necessarily have all the diagnosis information at the time of request, and that can still trigger that accommodation process. So just identifying that they have that functional difficulty. And as I mentioned, there can be some risks to individuals to disclosing. So this,
yeah, sorry, go ahead, Kelly.
So we just wanted to share one quote that we had that we came across in the research, but I'll pass it over to Rebecca so that she can continue on with the next one.
Yeah. So this quote is just really highlighting the fear that many people with disabilities will experience when it comes to disclosure, and that disclosure isn't um, experienced as a neutral event, that for some people it really does they do feel vulnerable and at risk when they disclose their disability. So this particular example is around neurodiversity, but we do see that with other disabilities as well, including especially those that are highly stigmatized, such as mental health and so forth. Um, what we find is that many people hesitate to disclose. They avoid disclosure, and they do try to conceal when possible and manage their disability on their own. This often can put people at risk because the disclosure will happen when questions around their job performance come up. And that's often because they chose not to disclose until they felt like they had to. So it's important to understand that disclosure process. Kelly, I'm not sure if there was anything else you wanted to add about this, but this is something we see a lot in mental health and for workers living with mental illnesses. They do manage or attempt to manage on their own for as long as possible.
And like just to touch more on that piece about like that fear of impact and repercussions. I've even worked with some employees where I've seen them perhaps for like an ergonomic assessment, for example, and they've shared what some of their medical diagnoses are with me that may be impacting them at work, and they're not comfortable disclosing that to their employer for fear of what that could mean. And so their preference is just to kind of continue on with perhaps a little bit better workplace setup, but not indicating that that's related to any like diagnosis or disability reason. And so there's definitely fear for people of how that might impact them, ability to grow within the organization or be promoted and things like that. And so that can have an impact for individuals as well in terms of seeking accommodation, right? If they're not able to or comfortable to disclose, then they may miss out on what they may need to perform the best at work, or they may have to compensate in some ways. So what can you ask if an employee does disclose to you that they have a disability or a medical diagnosis that they may require some accommodation? So you can ask some questions about how it relates to doing the job. So what is the functional difficulty? That they take a little bit more time to do something, or they have a little bit of difficulty hearing. So having, captioning on the screen during meetings is helpful, or follow-up notes. There may be something functional that they can comment on. How the workplace can be changed or improved. So you can ask them that question if there's something that they may see that would be helpful. How the work hours could be changed to help them perform better in their role. So if there is some flexibility or accommodation in that way, you can ask them about that. If that's available from your organization, how to keep the workplace safe for the candidate and everyone else, whether there is any information or awareness training that the candidate would like to provide to colleagues. So sometimes we do have employees that we see for assessment who would like to share with their team about their experience, or even specifically about what their diagnosis is. And so that may be something that the employee that you're working with would like to do, or they would be comfortable with having some general education about a specific grouping of disability or function that they would be comfortable for their team to be aware of. And then what are some things that you're not really able to ask? So you're not able to ask specific questions about their lifestyle or how they manage their disability. They may decide to offer you some of that information, but you're not able to really kind of pry and ask those questions. General questions about their health or disability. So you're not able to ask about their specific diagnoses or some specific details around that. Details around seeing their doctor or what their doctor says to them in appointments. Though you can ask them if there are any restrictions that their healthcare provider has suggested or any information that they can provide that would be helpful when thinking about accommodations in the workplace. And for example, you can't ask any specific details about their medication or their types of treatments that they're receiving and things. So we just wanted to highlight as well that there is a legal requirement and a duty to accommodate. So that legal obligation falls under Section 2 and 15 of the Canadian Human Rights Act. And it's important that employees are accommodated to allow them to perform their duties to the best of their ability. And that if you're in a management role, that one of your responsibilities is around being able to identify and remove those barriers for those requesting accommodation. So are there things that you can do within your organization or within your team to help simplify those processes and remove some of those barriers? So can it be educating your whole team about the accommodation process so that if that is something that someone needs at a particular time, they know how to go about asking for that, that information and documents are easily accessible for everyone in different formats. And so really thinking about how can you remove some of those barriers. And then that employers are responsible for bearing the cost for disruptions and for adjustments up to undue hardship. And so really, if you're thinking that this accommodation request or recommendation for accommodation is something that may be difficult to implement, you have to really look at, being able to demonstrate that it is going to cause undue hardship. And so there's quite a few steps that need to take place to demonstrate that. So really, are there ways that you can accommodate this person? Are there simple accommodations that can be put in place to allow them to continue to work and to do their best? So I just wanted to highlight this perspective around adjustments or accommodations. But sometimes people will have their own perspective or interpretation about that. So sometimes we may see people, voicing that maybe accommodations are an unfair advantage, or this coworker is getting a special privilege, or concerns to the organization that this is adding this financial burden, or this person is gaining special treatment. And just as you wouldn't ask your coworker who wears glasses to take them off because you think that they're having an unfair advantage over you, so too you shouldn't consider an accommodation that's put in place for an employee that has a disability. You may sometimes experience some difficulty and concerns from colleagues or coworkers or voiced frustration if they are coming at this accommodation with some of those perspectives in the top half of the graphic there. But that may be your signal to think about how you support that individual in dealing with their feelings around that, and maybe educating them about the accommodation process. And perhaps there may be an accommodation process or accommodation need that they have for themselves, and they just haven't voiced it. And that's maybe where some of those feelings of resentment or unfair advantage are coming from. And so you may need to spend some time connecting with them and clarifying those pieces. So really, accommodations are just tools and measures to help people. It provides opportunity for people to do their best work in their job role and to grow within the company. it's part of inclusion and empowerment, equity, and productivity. It helps to support access in the workplace and to opportunities, to networking, to innovation. And it's part of support and a legal requirement for individuals. And so for ourselves as occupational therapists, we may be educating the employee who needs that support. And through the clients we work with at Gowan, we may be spending some time doing education with their other workplace parties, such as the manager or HR representatives or disability case managers. So not only we're providing some support to an employee, but we may be providing some support through the organization or through some trainings that we run for organizations that are looking for more education on workplace health and wellness topics or around disability inclusion, neurodiversity inclusion, and fostering that, and how do we bring that into our workplace and support our teams. And I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, building off of everything that Kelly has shared about accommodations, another way to think about accommodations. So, accommodations are often viewed as a cost, but we also can't forget the positive nature of change and diversity that we've been really talking about over last weekend and building on that today. Sometimes doing things differently is better and can be better, and we can extract other spill-off benefits from increasing diversity at work. So the return on investment can also be broader. We have to think of it as being broader than the initial cost or the initial investment into the accommodation, whether it's monetary costs of purchases or time costs within the organization. When we launch accommodations, when we provide accommodations, even though it's to the individual, for that individual, it will we know research has told us that it leads to better retention and lower turnover, but it does have an impact on the larger culture of the organization that creates a positive culture of support where we see people's needs being met and people feeling more satisfied at work. And those, although it's hard to monetize those benefits, those can be really important. So the accommodation process has initial costs, usually in terms of time and money, but there's huge potential for benefits for the organization. So going to the next slide, just to get you to, we know a lot of you on the line have a lot of ideas and experience in this area. We're wondering if you could share some examples from your own experience. So what accommodations have you seen requested or have you provided during the hiring and interviewing stage? So the way to engage with this is you can either scan the QRL, or you can go to slido.com and enter the code. If any of that is challenging, we will also be monitoring the chat here if you want to share your ideas.
Yeah, so we're just getting you to kind of think about, I know that we talked about last day around the hiring and interviewing stages, and we wanted to get people kind of sharing their ideas a little bit because oftentimes this is one that people bring up as a even more difficult area. Can still be some challenges around that accommodation in that onboarding process, and then once the employee is there. But a big one that I find that comes up is that there's not as much focus on the hiring and interview stage. So it'd be interesting to hear what others are doing or have done. So I see people typing, so we'll just give it a couple of minutes and then we can move on to the other slide.
And if typing isn't your thing, you can also unmute yourself and share your ideas. That's fine too.
Great. got a couple of answers there. Some
Yeah.
interviews that changed over to video calls instead of, like, I'm assuming instead of in person, having the online application changed to a paper copy to make that process a little bit easier, right? So when we were talking about last day, thinking about making that recruitment process and application process more accessible, so accessible to more people. So having the opportunity for different formats and reaching different groups. Great.
And another thing about that we're hearing more and more about when we're talking about inclusive interviewing is thinking about what are the skills that you want to see in the candidate, because some people are very good at presenting themselves and telling you what they can and can't do. Sometimes people's account of what they can and can't do is accurate. Sometimes it's not on in either way, and sometimes people just don't present well. But having a task that people do that relates to the job tasks is another way of conducting interviews in an inclusive way, because then you're actually able to see what can the person do. So whether it's a very short kind of homework assignment that they submit as part of the application or so forth, it really depends on the position and what it is that you want to know that they can do. So really thinking that through, knowing that not everybody can accurately present themselves in an interview.
Mhm. And so because we're talking about accommodations today, we wanted to talk about a few things with relation to the interviews as well. So I'll let you continue on, Rebecca.
Yeah. So, knowing that some of these changes or accommodation can actually be low cost or free, um, you want to make use of tasks or of tools that you already have in your organization. So, related specifically to interviews, allowing some additional time for the interview, and as I mentioned already, tasks associated or allowing more time with the recruitment process. We already have talked about the online uh, looking at alternatives to completing online applications. And if you are doing a video conference call or a Zoom call instead of an in-person, making sure that you provide what the person needs in that context, whether it's live captioning or interpreter services or support person, having that in place. With Zoom and Teams, these kinds of things can be quite simple and already built into our platforms. Just making them available for individuals without them having to ask is actually a really good approach. And the other thing about doing video conferencing as opposed to in person is you remove any barriers that are really out of your control around transportation and commuting. So that's very helpful. Um, we want the accommodation process to be low barrier. We want people who need accommodations to be able to get the accommodations in as fast as possible and without any challenges. But unfortunately, we know that there are actually barriers out of our control in the workplace. There are barriers associated with being diagnosed in Canada, especially around certain conditions like mental health conditions and so forth. There are long waits to see mental health professionals who are able to make that diagnosis. So what we need is a process that people can get informal accommodations without a formal diagnosis. And this can be really important for people with mental health conditions, neurodiversities, and so forth, where that diagnostic process can be really lengthy. Um, so actually, what we have found in our research is that informal accommodations are actually very common in the workplace, and many people rely on them. They have relationships that they lean in on with their manager and supervisor, and that these accommodations happen very informally. These can work really well, but they can also put everybody at risk when there's organizational change. So just to keep that in mind, although informal accommodations can work well, they can be risky over a long over time. What other ways to eliminate barriers to the accommodation process is to make sure everybody in the workplace has information about accommodations, how to request them, and so forth. And this is especially true for new hires, but also important for people who are already in the workplace. And we also have something called scaffolding, which is somewhere in between the formal accommodation process and the informal accommodations, which is about providing temporary supports as people when people need them before they have that formalized diagnosis. So that can be really helpful as well, is to kind of scaffold that process. The other concept that's in the literature that we hear about is being aware of interactional barriers in the provision of accommodations and accessibility supports. And this is really the how of how people interact in the workplace. It's about people and their interactions with technology, with space, and with resources. And overall, it's really important to keep in mind that you can't approach disability with the idea of a one size fits all, that disability is very complex, it's very individualized. And that's where working with an occupational therapist can be really helpful. They can, occupational therapists often have knowledge about disability and the complexities of diverse disabilities, and also an understanding of workplace processes. So they can really be that go-between to help facilitate that interaction. So going to the next slide, this slide is really helping us to reimagine this concept of disability and focusing on supporting a strength-based approach to highlight you know, this shift, this culture change as being a really positive process. And it moves us away from deficit to strength, where we think about the language we're using to describe disability management, and really focusing on how this whole process of inclusion can help strengthen organizations, improve organizational culture, and also highlight the strength that individuals within this process bring to the overall organization. Sorry, here, I've just lost my place here. So really important during the onboarding process to make sure that information is shared with incoming members of an organization in various formats, that we ensure that people have the time they need to learn organizational processes and learn their role in the organization. And that we think about and work with people to ensure they have what they need. So many people need to have less background noise. They may need lighting within their workspace. They may need schedule changes that include rest, and there also may be some technological tools or software that will support them in doing their job. So it's important to have this discussion with people as they onboard into the organization, and then ongoing to keep this discussion going, especially around technology because it's constantly changing, and we need to make sure that workers have what they need to do their job. And so, importantly, in this process is to ask the employee to make sure that people have a way of sharing what they need, what they find helpful, what they find difficult, what's working for them to keep this dialogue going, really to ask and also to create multiple ways that people can share their experience. Knowing that there's diversity, that not everyone's going to have the same experience with the same tools. And this is important as people come into the organization, as people move within the organization, and as technology and work systems change and evolve over time.
And so we just wanted to highlight a little bit about the accommodation process. So if you are trying to support an employee who needs some accommodation, especially in the situation where perhaps it is more difficult, complex needs for this individual, what does this kind of look like? And how could that process happen within the organization? So thinking about that identification of concern or functional challenges, the employee perhaps brings that forward, or perhaps it's something that the manager has observed some difficulty with how the employee is performing and connects with them about could this be related to a diagnosis of some type. And so the manager may provide initially some adjustments or support. So as Rebecca mentioned earlier, some of those informal strategies, or there may be some tools that are available to all team members that the manager is aware of and may spend some time in supporting the employee or putting some of those in place themselves. In a more complicated or complex situation, they may be connecting with an accommodation specialist or HR, or engaging external providers such as an occupational therapist, or what we do at Gowan Consulting. So we may be asked to come and see the employee and do a full assessment to really more clearly determine what their accommodation needs are and provide those recommendations about what the workplace can put in place to support this person in their job role. So with that process, we would be identifying those barriers through that assessment piece. And we're able to, as an external provider, look at that medical information that may be impacting their function and review some of those strategies with them and put those recommendations in place, or if it may be training or skill building around a certain aspect or tool, we can do that with them. And then it would be implementing those strategies or accommodations. So some things may be temporary, like we mentioned earlier, with building up that scaffolding and letting people some time to acquire those skills or put those systems in place, and then they carry on with that. And there may be other accommodations that are needed on an ongoing or permanent basis. And then once that plan is sort of fully implemented, that would be likely the manager that would continue to monitor that if new challenges arise, or if a tool is no longer really working, those types of things, or just monitoring that things are still working and going smoothly. And so when would we go through this process? So a formal assessment might be needed at different times. And maybe that there are some specific considerations for the type of job demands, or perhaps the work environment or the worker's own abilities that are a little bit more complicated and difficult to just use some of the straightforward accommodation ideas that you have or are familiar with. And there may be some more detailed information that's needed that really a professional who is able to do that, like an occupational therapist, to determine where those functional needs might be. It might need an assessment when the combination is really kind of unknown and you're looking for that more creative, in-depth solution that those initial attempts haven't really been able to solve. And so they'll allow you to kind of consider some different options. Sometimes we may look at some ideas around tools and see what's already available within the organization that can kind of fit and match with what those functional needs are. And that us being there or the external party completing that work accommodation assessment provides you with that assistance to then implement those recommendations. And so there may be some strategies around that, the approach that you do with that, how to be successful or for them to be there as we are with the employees that we support for part of that journey and getting that accommodation plan really in place and solidified so that it can be taken forward by the employee and their supervisor. So I wanted to provide you with just some different resources around accommodation. So there are a number of different organizations and tools out there that are shared online. So Job Accommodation Network is one. I did include also some specific diagnostic resources. And so this is just a very quick list, but you can sometimes looking at a diagnosis specific support organization, they will include on their website some resources for work accommodation. So that's a great place to start, especially if the employee is looking for some ideas on their own. And even just looking at different organizations, even if it's not the same diagnoses as you might be aware of, or if you are not sure what the employee's diagnosis is, there may be some helpful tips and accommodation strategies on their website as well, even if it's not specific. So for example, the Arthritis Society, a person with chronic pain issues may be impacting their mental health and their cognitive function. And so the accommodations provided on that website may be helpful as well for other employees that might have some neurocognitive challenges. You know, for us at Gowan Consulting, we also can be a resource around accommodation. So if you have some challenging cases, complex employee situations, or need that accommodation assessment, JDAP tool. And so there's a number of different resources that you can look for that. I wanted to highlight as well, thinking about when change happens in organizations. And so this is an important factor when we're thinking about disability inclusion in the workplace. And we've noticed, especially over the last few years, that change is a constant. It's always happening. It's always ongoing. So thinking about how you can be proactive with all employees to communicate those upcoming changes, allowing time for people to process that and adjust to those changes, creating a plan with the employee. So if you do have an employee who specifically has difficulty with change or needs more time with processing that information, perhaps there is a specific plan that they as an individual need, and that might be something that you work on with them and implement aside from the greater change plan that's coming forward. Continuing to respect their preferences regarding disclosure. So this relates to if team members change or if the manager leaves and a new manager coming on, keeping in mind that really it's up to the individual to disclose about their disability, and it's not appropriate to necessarily say, oh, you know, there's Kelly, she has XYZ disability. They may want to wait to disclose to this new manager or new teammate. And so that's perhaps something that you may want to check in with them about, or leave it to them and let them know, you know, if you're comfortable sharing with this new person about your disability, I'm going to leave it to you for when you're comfortable with that. So keeping that in mind, and that's also can be part of confidentiality. And encouraging employees and managers to reach out to work with the HR team or other supports within the organization, using job coaches when changes are expected to be happening. And so with that, I just wanted to highlight thinking about the employee and their support circle, right? So we have a number of individuals in the organization who can act as a support or in those roles that are a support to an employee. We've even included, perhaps a colleague that's their team buddy, or if you have employee peer groups within your organization. There's some organizations who do have disability specific employee peer groups, or even sometimes diagnosis groups. So maybe like a neurodiversity support group or mental health support group. Sometimes employees may feel a little uncomfortable with those groups as well, in case they're fearful that if I attend, will that disclose that I have that specific disability? So you may think about how you frame it, or frame the participation of any individual, those types of things, or just connecting people with outside groups if that's more comfortable. And then thinking about the support circle that they have that is external to the organization, family, friends, perhaps they have something through their benefits where they could hire an external coach, or there is some other supports through their benefits that would allow them to take advantage of that outside of that individuals in the organization.
So the next two slides are really some resources that I encourage you to check out, disability specific as well as IDEA and so forth that we've already mentioned. So, and then here is, this is from the Ontario Society of Occupational Therapists that really suggests and highlights what working with an OT can provide. We only have a couple minutes left, so I know there's already two questions in the chat, and I want to make sure we get to that. So I want to address the first question by Kelly about some examples of flexible or scaffolding accommodations and what they can look like. So the scaffolding idea is really this idea of temporary accommodations until the formalized process is complete. And so you might provide accommodations knowing that the formalized process is forthcoming. The idea of flexible accommodations, or what I refer to as informal, might be an arrangement between a person who needs accommodations at work and the rest of their team or their manager that gives them flexibility around their schedule, or building in rest periods, or working from home that aren't formalized. And these might be accommodations that are available to everybody in the workplace, but they might be just available to that person knowing they needed it for some disability related issue, but they haven't gone through the formalized process, which means that if the manager changes or there's a organizational restructure, they might lose that good faith or so forth that's been put in place. Yeah. Did you want to add to that, Kelly?
Yeah, and I was going to say another piece of that too, the flexibility piece could also be where there is some accommodations that the employee has access to when they need it. So, for example, if the employee has an episodic disability, there may be times that they are functioning differently, that they don't need to use all of their accommodation tools that are available to them. And so some of the time they when they're working, they may look different in what they're doing in their work and what tools they're using. And then there may be other times that they do need to rely on those accommodations when they may have a flare up with their disability, or their function changes up and down. And so that might be part of their flexible process as well.
And I know it's 1 o'clock, but I did want to answer the second question about what we would recommend to teams who don't see working through this process as part of their work. Here, I would really highlight the return on investment. That's just so clear. In some of the work that we did with the Mental Health Commission around accommodating people living with mental illness, we found the return on investment was always positive, and we worked, that economic analysis was done by Emil Tompa. And sometimes it was like 12-fold or 15-fold or so forth. I can't remember the numbers offhand, but it was significant. So there is an investment up front in costs, but the output, the return is so significant that it makes good business sense to invest in the people within your organization and take time to create the environment that can accommodate diversity.